Amazing.
All right.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hanging out. I'm Brusha, making a little cameo here just to intro this really, really fantastic panel that I know personally I'm really excited for to really add some extra perspective on this day. This is Novel Models for On-Chain Giving and Public Goods Funding. We have the wonderful David Casey of Funding the Commons here moderating, Anna Stone from GoodDollar, Benjamin from OpenCivics, and Sav from Gitcoin. A really fantastic group. We're just going to get Sav in here really quick. Oh, amazing. Here you are. Yeah, so this session is really about kind of talking transparently with some of my favorite builders in the impact ecosystem about, what is working, what is not working, what are our visions for the future as we're building, new tooling for grant making, new tooling to make funding with a diverse range of assets more accessible for the communities that, we really want to continue seeing doing the amazing work in the space, and really having a better understanding for what's coming down the pipeline when we are talking about public goods and impact. So I think this conversation rounds out, especially some of the earlier conversations that were focusing on some more traditional grant making visions and experience, and really brings us back into this, pure on-chain space, and the way that we're designing for better systems. So I'll hand it over to David and the rest of y'all. And I'm really excited to get to listen to all of this. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you for hosting. And yeah, really excited for this panel today with some folks doing really awesome work in the public goods funding space. I figure we can start with a round of introductions. Anna, would you like to lead it?
Sure, why not? Hi, David. Good to see you. Good to see you guys all, and thanks for having us at the On-Chain Giving Summit. Thanks to Endaoment and Robbie and the whole team. My name is Anna Stone. I'm the executive director of the GoodDollar project. GoodDollar is a project that's actually focused on using public blockchain networks to funnel money widely to individuals or beneficiaries around the world. We do this through creating a crypto universal basic income, which is designed to give out in cryptocurrency every single day a modest digital income stipend to every registered member of the GoodDollar network. We've been operating since 2020 and have onboarded nearly 1 million people into Web3 through distributing crypto universal basic income, and are actually one of the most widely used projects and protocols in the world. We have hundreds of thousands of people that claim GoodDollar UBI every single month, and the majority of those individuals are coming from emerging markets where capital is very scarce and where fintech tooling is quite limited, places where there are many families living on less than $200 a day. And so I'd say that GoodDollar is an example of how we can use blockchain to kind of rethink how we think about giving, and actually how do we build last mile solutions that actually get, money or whatever the asset may be to the last mile beneficiaries of the people who need it.
Thank you. Benjamin, would you like to follow?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So my name is Benjamin Life. I am a co-founder of OpenCivics, and our consortium is a decentralized organization of builders who are working on creating tools for grassroots communities and really trying to fill the gap of coordination around the interoperability of solutions that directly empower communities. I think more and more we are beginning to see that actually the changes that need to happen are not band-aids on our current systems, but actually creating new kinds of systems with different incentives, different types of infrastructure. And so we created our consortium as a way to help provide a coordination interface for people who are building these kind of underlying infrastructures for new kinds of systems. And so we've been really grateful to be an early partner of Gitcoin's Community Rounds program, bringing our community into the Gitcoin world to distribute grants with the hypothesis that if we give funding to builders who are in non-rivalrous coordination relationships with each other, we're going to see a greater return on impact, because the kinds of solutions that those builders are creating will be interoperable and composable with each other and are oriented to directly serving communities of place to create an impact on the ground.
Thank you. And Sav, go ahead.
Sure, I'm Sav, head of grants here at Gitcoin. Gitcoin's been around since 2017. We help communities and ecosystems fund what matters to them, just like Ben, mentioned with OpenCivics. At our core, we're known for Gitcoin Grants, which is a program that we've run for some time. It uses quadratic funding, a novel funding mechanism that democratizes fundraising and helps to raise funds for digital public goods, open source software, and other causes. Over time, we've developed a decentralized stack that we run Gitcoin grants and our programs on top of, and now we're extending those out to other communities and ecosystems to use. And that includes quadratic funding, retroactive funding, and other funding mechanisms that we've developed. So it's great to be here, and I'm excited to be on this panel.
Thank you. All right, and I'll do a quick intro for myself. David Casey here. I run a public goods funding event series called Funding the Commons. It is a series of conferences, hackathons, and builder residencies that take place around the world. And we've also started to run our own micro experiments in public goods funding and experimental funding rounds. And we also run a sister conference called Earth Commons. So thank you all for being here. I will kick it off with a question for all of you. Feel free, whoever would like to take the mic first. What do you see as working in this environment in 2024 in terms of on-chain giving?
I'm happy to take a go. I think what brought me into the Web3 grants world in the beginning was really this open-ended, trust-based philanthropy that, the shadow side of this mechanism that we might be talking more about called quadratic funding, which enables this democratic allocation of resources through small donations, which help to, as a signaling mechanism for how to distribute larger pools of grant funding. That democratic and collective intelligence mechanism is very different from traditional philanthropy in the sense that it directly empowers communities to signal what they think should be funded. And I think sometimes in the philanthropy world, there's a lack of that kind of direct engagement with communities to determine how funds should be allocated. And so if you have a really good idea, even if you are new to the space or you haven't done it before, these kinds of mechanisms create an opportunity for people to receive early stage funding to take an idea and start to iterate on it. I think we can get into the things that aren't working, because sometimes it's hard to go from that initial funding stage to actual ongoing operational funding. But I think what's really working in on-chain giving right now is this kind of blue sky orientation to funding early stage projects and using this kind of collective intelligence of a community to determine those allocations instead of a kind of top-down bureaucratic system or a series of experts.
Maybe I can tag onto that a little bit. What I see as working is the fact that we continue to lower the barriers for people to be able to participate and use these different types of funding mechanisms. If this was just a few years ago, fees were much higher. There were much less networks that people could leverage these on top of. The user experience wasn't as great. I know we get a lot of flack sometimes for the user experience, but it has improved dramatically over the last few years. And we're also seeing that now these mechanisms, these approaches are becoming composable, and other communities can kind of latch onto them, fork them, adapt them, and we're seeing that quite a bit at Gitcoin. we developed the Allo protocol in the hopes of this. So originally Gitcoin Grants was run on a centralized stack that Kevin essentially developed in his basement. And about a little less than two years ago, we moved to a decentralized stack that now any community can use to run quadratic funding rounds, fork, build on top of, et cetera. And I see with this, the proliferation of L2 networks, the cost of running your own rounds and, engaging with these different types of funding mechanisms, the user experience improving, the amount of developers that we have coming in the space and starting to iterate on these ideas really starts to enable, builders and communities just like been at OpenCivics, to be able to take these and extend these and, start to use those and make real world impact. So I'd say that is what I see working every day, and it's exciting.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Participation, lowering the barriers to entry in terms of what it actually means to be an on-chain giver, and then actually being pleasantly surprised and delighted by the number of people that actually want to participate in on-chain giving. It's something that I think is really fun and encouraging to see every single day. I think that what Gitcoin has done is a great example of that, right? So not only promoting and teaching people and educating people about what quadratic funding is, but actually going through and doing the business development work so that quadratic funding has real value for people who are making small donations, right? So I think that's the corporate matching that Gitcoin has done, has really encouraged individuals to participate, if you will, where giving $1 or giving $2 has a real impact. And I think that this is going to create kind of a domino effect around how individuals relate to corporate donations and how you can express your voice through philanthropy, right? Through small on-chain philanthropy. I know that one of the things that has always really surprised me and impressed me is how generous people can be with tokens at times, and especially because it's less precious in many ways than like the money you have in your bank account. And one of the most fun things I've seen is actually like GoodDollar users that give $GoodDollars to one another, and do it just because it's simple and it's easy and it's free and it's, because people want to give, right? So I think that platforms that actually continue to lower the barriers to entry and gamify the experience of giving, and then continue to educate people on how individuals can relate to the bigger corporate donations. I think we're going to see a lot more. I think giving is actually a great use case to drive crypto mass adoption because it's something that everyone can relate to and wants to participate in.
Yeah, I totally agree in that it is a real one of those sleeper possibilities towards mass adoption. And I just saw a really cool PayPal integration into Gitcoin donations that was being tested for this round, which is really exciting. One thing that I kind of would like to ask you guys about quadratic funding is how can or is this even a bad thing, or should we try to mitigate when it devolves into something more like a popularity contest where the community is able to mobilize a bunch of people to vote for them and get a large amount of the matching funds based on like marketing ability, and is this something we should encourage because it brings more users into Web3 and into public goods?
I can speak on that a little bit. A big part of my job at Gitcoin is not just helping with the Gitcoin Grants program and our own internal programs, but helping other communities to design, implement, and kind of manage their own programs. And we're starting to see more and more of those start to delve in with quadratic funding. We're actually running some rounds today with an organization that's very focused on creator economy. And I was on a Twitter Spaces the other day, and one of the community members popped up and said, "This sure sounds like a PvP environment," and it was the first time that I had heard it described like that. And I could definitely see outside looking in, someone that wasn't familiar with the mechanism, looking at this as something that you're competing against everyone else in the round. But the reality is what we see is, many of the large players in the round actually have the ability to create a rising tide, and so that's more of the way that I'm trying to look at this and explain and even educate some of these communities is, we need to look at this as a collaboration where the round is successful if everyone's successful, and whether that be large projects that have a lot of influence or smaller ones that are just getting started or somewhere in between, can we all work together and collaborate and create that environment that everyone gets to participate, everyone kind of gets a piece, and you're growing the pie versus taking it all for yourself. The other side of that is, we've developed different ways with the mechanism that you can protect against some of those, and those could be things like matching caps or minimum donations or cluster matching, or different ways that you can look at the round results and have more faith, in the legitimacy of those, and even be able to, as a round operator, filter out, some of those that maybe are trying to game, the mechanism. And so it's not perfect, but I definitely think that there's things that could be done in terms of educating communities and having the right spirit of intent in how you design the round, and also from the mechanism side of things, putting those protections in place that you can have faith in.
Yeah, and I think it's also a question of what problem are you looking for quadratic funding to solve, right? Because I think what if we consider the alternative, which is like the alternative form of funding, which is that typically it's happening in a fully top-down centralized manner where you have a foundation that is selecting their own causes and then selecting behind the scenes their own criteria, etc. There isn't the space for participation or transparency, right? Quadratic funding is simply a tooling approach for how do we incorporate the voice of the crowd or incorporate the voice of the community in terms of asset and resource allocation, right? So it's not going to be the perfect solution for every single use case, but I think if we're looking at how can we actually drive participation, how can we enable small donors to have a voice, how can we enable create the incentive to give, how can we, it solves for a range of other problems while creating new ones.
Yeah, not much to add on to what you both shared. I think that was very a great summary. We're experimenting with some other approaches around how do you create contained rounds or grants programs where it's not just the general public who are making allocation decisions, but a predefined community. And so we're experimenting with flow funding, where we're gating access to these decisions based on who is a member of the consortium. And so that if you're donating to a matching pool that's going to be distributed through this mechanism, the amount that's distributed will be determined by a smaller group of peers who probably have a better sense of each other's projects than the general public. And so this is a way for us to kind of have many different mechanisms that account for the shortcomings of each one, and to say, as Anna was saying, when do we want the general public to be weighing in, and that's adding value to the allocation process, and when do we want a smaller community to be making those decisions? And the beautiful thing about these tools is that they are basically building blocks that empower communities to make these decisions themselves. And we're seeing this flourishing of many different approaches. And so, I think as soon as you launch something new, you realize what its shortcomings are, and that informs this ongoing development of new types of mechanisms that can be used for different approaches that kind of resolve for the popularity contest component of quadratic funding.
And just to tag onto that a little bit, I'm starting to have more and more conversations about how can these different novel funding mechanisms and even traditional funding mechanisms like direct grants work in harmony with one another. I think, Anna hit it on the head, where what's the desired outcomes? Like, what are you trying to achieve, and what are the best ways that you can map, funding mechanisms to that? And so, an approach I've been talking about is quadratic funding is great to kick off an initiative, kick off a campaign, create signaling, put onus on the grantees to self-market themselves, to activate their community based on the results of that round. That can give, an organization great signal to what could be grantees or for, projects that could be worthy of larger amounts of direct funding with very specific, objectives that they have to achieve. And then over time, as you see those achieved, that could be a great use case eventually for retro funding and, funding impact and retrospective. And then there's even more interesting kind of like variants that we're seeing where we recently implemented a Macy variant of QF. And I know that Macy's also done that with, retro funding. And so even with these novel funding mechanisms, there's now new novel approaches and variants of the mechanism, which really in my mind kind of speaks to like the power of what we're dealing with here and how, to use a cliche term, we're so early.
All right. Yeah, and I've been enjoying watching the evolution of the Sybil resistant technologies like Gitcoin Passport and their increasing effectiveness to really make the votes more meaningful. Yeah, I would love to hear from you what kinds of new mechanisms that any of you are seeing emerging in the past few months and couple years that you have your eye on as promising.
Yeah, I can go first.
Go for
Maybe retro funding is definitely one that is very hot right now. Optimism, is definitely a pioneer in that and created a system that in some ways is similar to quadratic funding. You still have an organization putting up a pool of funds. There's still a gating mechanism where that organization is going to select who the grantees are based on some eligibility criteria. But instead of donations coming in to act as votes, you have experts, or as Optimism calls them, badge holders, that make those decisions, apply those votes, and then based on how the votes land in the weighting, that proportionally kind of distributes the funding. As that's evolved, we're starting to see different approaches to retro funding. That one of the things that Onchain brings us is the ability to look at empirical metrics on chain. And there's ways that you can start to look and define what is the impact you want over time, and then maybe automate aspects of the retro funding mechanism versus it being up to, human decision making. And so that's some of the conversations that we're starting to have with some different partners around how we might be able to adapt the retro funding mechanism and make it more automated and not so subjective to human decisions, and starting to partner with partners like Open Source Observer and others that are able to look at those on-chain characteristics and derive true impact metrics that you can then measure against.
Yeah, we're undertaking a similar and aligned and integrated approach to impact attestations, because I think this is one of the main areas that traditional philanthropy has also struggled with. And in some ways, I think on-chain philanthropy is trying to reinvent the wheel here. But we have an opportunity to really innovate in terms of how is impact measured and attested. And the beauty of retroactive funding would be to say, I want to fund tree planting. I don't care about which organizations are doing it, but if you have planted a tree and that impact has been attested to in these following parameters, then you will retroactively be compensated irrespective of the project that you're doing. And so right now we are running a research process to try to develop kind of a pattern language for these schemas. How can we help grantees identify, based on the types of impact that they're creating, what types of schemas they should use to report that impact? And then eventually what we hope to achieve is a kind of impact validation network, where we can have a decentralized group of auditors that are basically incentivized to go through the impact attestations and validate them, potentially making them eligible for more funding. And then, as I mentioned before, we're also experimenting with a new kind of flow funding mechanism that's being developed by a group called Flow State. And this allows for any donor to put funds into a matching pool. And then our community will have a certain set of quadratic votes, like voting tokens that they can place on top of each project. And that will determine which portion of the stream of funding is directed to each project. And then similar to that, we're also setting up a series of splits contracts. And these are smart contracts where if you send resources to a single address, those funds will be distributed automatically to a series of other addresses. And so if you want to fund projects in a particular domain, you could send them to governance.opencivics.eth, and then all of those funds will go to all the governance-related projects in the consortium. And we're experimenting with a star voting system for our members to be able to select their weighted preference of how much of each donation should go to each group. And so we're trying to create these kind of financial plumbing lines that allow resources to move more effectively and easily from donors out to networks of grantees.
Just one thing that I'll offer, like that's kind of just zooming out, if you will, is that one of the areas where blockchain has a true competitive advantage, or on-chain giving has a true competitive advantage over traditional giving, is that you can make it cheaper than $1 to send $1, right? So I think that the solutions that are out there that are starting to build towards how do we solicit millions of dollars of $1 donations and how can we actually mobilize people at scale. I think this is really interesting. It's really exciting. It's an example where there's a very clear competitive advantage of blockchain over existing solutions. It can prove something really new and novel in terms of human behavior and on-chain giving. So that's I'm always looking at, like, Giveth is a great example of that, but I also think Gitcoin's a good example of that, and also different communities as they start to run their own community-based donation campaigns. I think this idea of how do you change the idea of who is a philanthropist and how they can give, and how does the plumbing actually enable that, is interesting to look at. Another area that I'm looking at is also like, how are we again having to do with expanding participation, but how does expanding the asset mix of what we accept as donations also help fund more projects, right? So I think Endaoment's a great example of this. They've developed a solution where you can donate in pretty much any token, right? And enable that to be translated into real liquid fiat currency that's going towards a registered charity and give the donor the tax benefit. I think that's a great example of that. But I also think there's a lot of new models for ongoing giving and impact giving that we're not even at the precipice of exploring yet, right? So how can there be different staking nodes that are committed to donating their ongoing yield over a 10-20 year period, right? And how could that be distributed through other different platforms to provide those ongoing funding sources, right? Or how could specific liquidity pools or liquidity providers that are all common within one pool actually vote for where they send their fees, right? So I think all of these different, we are dealing with a lot of magic internet money, right? And how are we actually going to use the magic internet money to expand the amount of money that's going towards impact causes? And I think we're really just at the beginning of that, but it's going to be really fun to watch what people come up with.
Yeah, this kind of perpetual endowment model that I think is used in traditional philanthropy is really interesting, and I've seen it be deployed seemingly effectively with Octant.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have seen other examples similar or different. I know you guys do some of that as well at GoodDollar.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say we've tried to use the idea of like perpetual endowment as a source for funding the UBI, right? So how can you take the concept of a corporate donation and make it last longer for more people at scale? I think Octant is a great example. I mean, I think Octant's probably the strongest example of that, and probably the strongest because they had the most assets to start with, which gives you a great advantage. You have real money to give away then, right? So I think we'll see. I think that's a great. I think Octant's going to be an extremely teachable example for other foundations moving forward in terms of how you can take your endowment and potentially use it in a new way on chain.
Absolutely. Okay, I think would like to step back a bit and frame what we are talking about in terms of public goods. I know in the broader IRL worlds, there's a definition. I know with the Web 2 open source world, there's a definition which generally means open source software that is utilized for some public good or intangibly supporting beneficiaries or population. How do you guys see the definition of public goods when people talk about them in Web3? Is it like, open source software for people that are in Web3? Is it something that's useful for people in a specific ecosystem like Gitcoin or Optimism or Ethereum? Or how do you guys see this? Because for me, it seems like a really shifting definition depending on the perspective of the person.
Yeah, I think it's one of those terms that has in some ways lost its meaning because of how many different ways it's being used. But I try to come back to the traditional economics framing, which is something that is non-enclosable, which means it's a commons, anyone can use it. And it's non-rivalrous, which means that if I use it, it doesn't make it less possible for you to use it. And it makes a lot of sense that this term has become popularized in Web3 because there's so much infrastructure that we need to build from scratch on these on-chain systems. And all of those things are basically public utilities that enable us to do new kinds of things with a blockchain. And yet I think we've also kind of narrowed the scope of it in terms of things that are just purely abstract kind of, DeFi protocols or tools. And so I think that's led to it being sort of used more broadly as saying anything that is good for the public. And I try to walk back from that definition and say, actually, we should still be focusing on infrastructure, but infrastructure is not values neutral. And there are types of infrastructure that create positive externalities for the planet. And that's really the kind of social impact public goods philosophy that we have. Which is really, can we build tools and infrastructures that enable people to improve the quality of life and their ecologies and stewardship of their commons in place and online? And then also, I think education is one of the most powerful public goods. A curriculum is something that you can share broadly. You can translate into any language. And if I use that curriculum, it doesn't actually diminish someone else's ability to use that curriculum. So I see public goods as the tools that empower people to make the world a better place. And then also education as a public good that provides them with the skills and the know-how to be able to use those tools and apply them in their local communities.
Anyone else?
I mean, I
That was
agree
a
with
great
everything.
definition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great definition. Great definition. Just to add one thing, just to kind of like expand how maybe we think about it, is the universal basic income system we've tried to think about as free money as a public good, right? So what is actually the technology and the technology infrastructure of distributing money for free on chain, and then a layer up from that, making sure that all of the work that we've done is open source, so that if someone wants to go take it and create a better free money system, that we've given all of the love and knowledge and code that we've developed, in a way that it can be more easily replicated or riffed on, right? So in general, anything you're trying to Benjamin's definition was great.
I think for me, the last thing I would add to that is I'm probably biased in this opinion, but when you think about open source software, it's been around for decades now, and it's driven so much human progress and innovation over that time. And for me, in many ways, I see crypto as kind of like the natural evolution of that, where it enables greater interoperability, right, between systems, and it enables the ability to have incentives, direct incentives, built into those systems, programmable, right? And so I think all of the traditional definitions definitely apply. I don't think anything necessarily changes with crypto in more than it's just like you're adding fuel to it. You're adding new possibilities to it, and even being able to look at these approaches for public goods in the traditional sense that have been around for a long time. How can those be enabled, adapted, changed, improved, those types of things with greater supportive infrastructure?
I would just riff on that. I think that open source, has been such a transformative force in the world. And I think Web3 invites the philosophy of open source to start applying to many other aspects of society, because we now have this open-ended, highly composable and configurable, interoperable kind of substrate that if we are building on chain, anything that we create can be plugged into anything else on chain. And so it creates these positive feedback loops that I think aren't possible in other forms of impact, where it allows the impact that we create to start stacking and having these cascading benefits. Whereas if you were just to do that in a kind of Web 2 private equity funded or VC backed project, you have misaligned incentives that will eventually compel you to start extracting value from users. But if you build things as a public good, you actually benefit the more that people are using it for free. And so I think funding public goods is a strategy for creating systemic change on the planet, because it aligns those incentives with what's good for the public and what's good for the person who's developing the technology or the tool.
Thank you. Would love to hear from you guys what you see as challenges in the space of public goods funding in 2024, and kind of what you see as roadblocks or unresolved things within each of your organizations and broadly.
Why do I have a feeling that we're all going to come back to a relatively similar theme, which is money and the incentives of where money can flow? I think, I mean, I can speak for myself, which is that people come to this space of, public goods because they're trying to make, you're coming with good intention, right? You're trying to create really tooling that is of use to the world, but building software is expensive. And I think people who are at the intersection of crypto and impact are kind of on the double end of getting a double whammy of a market reality, if you will, which is that when you look at people who are funding initiatives in the crypto world, the incentive is not there, right? You're going to be able to make not only 5x, not only 10x, you're probably going to be able to make 500x on your initial investment. There's going to be an opportunity out there. There's going to be a good team. There's going to be a window. It's really hard to find the capital that's willing to say, like, yes, I'm betting on the long term. I'm betting on no return. I'm betting on the public good, and justify that decision to whoever they report to, right? So I'd say on the fund, in terms of who has the money, it makes it very hard on the crypto side. On the impact side, you're really out in the frontier, you're out in the unknown, you're working crypto as a bad brand. You go to any philanthropic organization, traditional foundation, government agency, you're facing many, many barriers in terms of branding, education, justification, overall lack of incentive to change way of doing things, and status quo, right? So I think those of us who are in this intersection of crypto and public goods, or crypto and social impact, really face not just a problem of how do we fund the projects that we want to see fund and how do we revolutionize funding, but actually how do we ourselves stay funded? How do we ourselves create a long-term operating strategy that enables us to continue to build and launch and support and update technology, which is a long-term endeavor. So that is hard.
Yeah, the big things that I see is sustainability. I think overall, like many projects in the crypto space, we're not at a place of sustainability yet. There's been some type of token generation event that's happened or something that's given, some initial amount of runway, but the runway ends at some point and there's not sustainability after that. And, kind of like figuring out how we achieve that. And then to Anna's earlier points, perception. It's really hard to overcome some of the perception of what crypto is. And, honestly, that perception is not always wrong if you look in the right places or the wrong places, maybe. But, us, that work in this space and are doing, this kind of work, just by proxy of being in crypto can be associated with things that are wildly different than the work that we actually do. I know when I talk to family members and friends and try and explain, the work you're doing, it's like a natural reaction if you say you work in crypto that you're some kind of strange day trader or something, and so getting people to kind of cross that chasm to realize, like what are we actually doing here and what can be achieved and what are we working towards is it's a fun conversation, to say the least. And so those are some of the things that I see.
Yeah, just to echo some of those funding challenges, we've run our grants program quarter by quarter, not knowing who's going to come in to do matching each time we run around. And so that's put us in a kind of tenuous place in terms of the long-term stability of our grants program. And I think, for now, there is enough alignment between the layer 2 foundations, the Optimisms, the Arbitrums of the world, that where they want to fund these kind of pro-social, social impact initiatives, but it's part of a larger strategy around driving adoption of their blockchain. And so the social impact funding is really contingent upon, am I adding users to this blockchain? And that sometimes is not the case. Sometimes we are onboarding new users, and I think like that's amazing. We're using social impact to bring new people into Web3, but those incentives are not always aligned. And I would love to see more traditional philanthropy starting to get into on-chain giving. And that's why I'm so grateful for folks like Endaoment for helping to normalize that crypto is actually a safe place for philanthropists. There are people with high integrity who are not doing Ponzi schemes, who have clear, credible, transparent mechanisms to allocate grant funding. And we really need right now those traditional philanthropic foundations and organizations to come in and see the good work that we've been doing with these layer 2 foundations and the funds that they have access to. And so I think we're in a pivotal moment right now where I feel like we have the record to show that we have that we're worthy of their trust, but we haven't yet formed that bridge between traditional philanthropy and some of these on-chain mechanisms. And then at a builder level, I think the challenges that we face right now are around attestations. How do we document the impacts that are being created with a sufficiently complexity sciences orientation is how I approach it. Is impact is very hard to measure. There are so many variables and they're all interconnected with each other. And so how do you determine that this intervention created this particular outcome? And then from that outcome, how do you determine what the impact and the value of that impact is? And so I think we run the risk now in the on-chain philanthropy world of perhaps unintentionally reproducing some of the same failure modes of traditional philanthropy as we're trying to scurry to legitimize ourselves.
How do you guys see these efforts and experiments in getting on-chain funding mechanisms adopted in traditional philanthropy? What are the barriers? You mentioned the brand of crypto itself, maybe misgivings around releasing full control of funds to projects that traditional institutional philanthropic organization may not want to be associated with funding. What do you guys see the barriers, and what successes do you see so far? Endaoment's doing great work, what else do you guys see on the horizon?
We have some examples at Gitcoin where we've seen that, which are promising. One of the biggest that I see is I'm actually having more and more conversations with governments and foundations and NGOs and like exactly the types of organizations that we want to be working with. But the speed at which that we operate and they operate could not be like more different, right? As we all know, there is a velocity that we operate in from a crypto perspective where days are years, right? From their perspective, it could literally take years to move anything forward, and that's just not the time horizons that we operate on. And so I'm seeing more of a willingness, which is great, but we're not at a place yet that like we can quickly deploy these mechanisms, get things stood up, run around tomorrow if you want to, right? But the speed at which that they, many of these organizations are operating at right now, we're just starting a lot of those conversations, and this is like a fiscal year next year, maybe, type of thing, which is not the speed that we want to be moving at.
Yeah, I'd agree with Sav that I think one of the biggest challenges are probably cultural and generational, and everything having to do with the fact that we're dealing with people and not technology, right? And what's most efficient is normally totally irrelevant to what actually ends up happening. I do think though that there is still a real desire, people who go to work in philanthropy and giving are also motivated by trying to make the world a better place, right? So I think there is a real intention and a real interest in learning about how new tooling can change and improve existing systems. I think if you talk to anyone who's had a career in nonprofits or philanthropics, they're probably philanthropy. They are probably the harshest critics of their own industry, probably not unlike crypto people. And so I think there's a lot of, I just think it's going to be like a generational change over time that happens. And I think, but what I will say is that there are incredible examples of where crypto technology already to this day, not one, but multiple, where the infrastructure of blockchain has proved superior to existing solutions, right? So I actually think the way that, there's a great example from the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where overnight, individuals were able to crowdsource millions and millions of dollars before the Red Cross even got up the giving page, right? And so as the world creates more crises and as crypto fills the gap, it's it's self-evident, you can't fight progress, right? But I don't think that there's any one. I think it's going to happen because that happens enough times and there's enough people who see it happen, and eventually 10 years from now those people will be in senior decision-making roles and be able to make large-scale changes. But you're going into institutions.
I would just jump in to add on. I agree with everything that's been shared. I think there's also a legal and fiscal set of challenges, and I think the legal innovation that's coming out of Wyoming is something I'm really heartened by, to have nonprofit designations for decentralized organizations to be able to have those kinds of legally compliant wrappers for on-chain social impact projects, I think will be really important. Currently, we just do KYC for the individual grantees. And so having more mechanisms that help converge legacy financial and legal systems with these emergent on-chain nonprofits, I think that will also open up a lot of potential for traditional funders to get involved.
Cool. In the last 5 minutes, I would love to open the floor for any final comments around the future of public goods funding, hopes of what you would wish to see, or anything else that you want to share.
I would say the reason that I'm still in this space and I haven't given up hope, even though there's this tremendous uphill battle for us in terms of what's currently broken in philanthropy and what's currently not working well in Web3 in terms of UX and adoptability and legal and compliance and regulatory. The reason I still believe in it is because of the transparency and accountability and self-governance and democratization of the allocation of resources that it represents. The fact that with any of the existing tooling, you can have small groups of people engaging in self-governance to coordinate these kinds of projects and to be able to make decisions together as a community. To me, that is our competitive advantage. That is what you just can't do with these traditional instruments, traditional legal structures and organizational models. There's an agility and there's also a transparency. So I think it's perfect for social impact work. It creates a very auditable trail of who's done what for what resources and enables donors to have really clear optics into how their resources are being used and creates an incentive landscape where we're optimizing for impact. And that is why I'm still in this space and why I'm really devoted to on-chain philanthropy.
I would say what keeps me here and what excites me the most is every day just the people, right? I mean, to Anna's earlier comments, the people that I'm working with every single day, not just at Gitcoin, but across all the organizations that we partner with, the communities that we extend into, that we support, that support us. There's a certain amount of grit, I think is maybe the best word for it, that the resolve, right? Like market downturns, bad things happening, collapses, like you name it, none of those things seem to deter. If anything, they embolden, right? And so it's really that amazes me. And it's a global community, right? I mean, every day I hop on virtual meetings like this, and it's not an uncommon day where I might talk to 10 different people across every single continent except the Arctic, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if someday I start to talk to people there that have mining rigs or something, I don't know, right? And so it's like, it's the community, it's the people, and it's the fact that this is a global community that's really rising up, that just, it's amazing.
Yeah, grit. I think that's grit and hope and choosing hope. So I think that's a choice and an exercise. Certainly if you're working, I mean, David, you've worked in this space for forever too. It's like you, year after year, it's a choice to continue to believe in the good of people and the power of technology to improve the world. It sounds fluffy, it sounds soft, it sounds idealistic, but it's living according to your values, and getting to build alongside people that have similar shared values is a privilege. And so you have to have conviction. You have to be in it for a real reason. You have to believe in it. But you meet incredible people who are also trying to change the world along the way. And you actually see, to everyone's point, how many people there are out there that really want to see you succeed and want to be a part of it. And so that is deeply, deeply motivating, and will remain so as we grow year after year.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. And yeah, I look forward to working with each of you and continuing to find ways to collaborate to move the space forward.
Amazing,
yeah, and thanks to Endaoment, because they're creating the space for us all to talk about it together.
Exactly.
Oh, well. Thank you guys for being here. We really, really appreciate just getting to pick your brain, hear what's exciting you, hear what's challenging you. And yeah, like one of the things that Robbie brought forward in like the lead keynote was this idea that we're kind of in this little phase that is called the trough of disillusionment. And it's just about kind of holding out, continuing our build, continuing to stay focused, continuing the weaving to move us beyond that chasm and into, more incremental efficiency and strength as like a community and as an infrastructure that, yeah, I think all of us need to be here to make sure it remains with values and, baking that impact in wherever we can. So just really grateful for your time today, everything you're working on. And yeah, hope to have you guys all here next year. For everybody who's still tuning in, we are going to move into a networking session. We changed the format a little bit, so we're just going to make it a meeting, and whoever's around who wants to say hey and kick it, we can hang out. We can make breakout rooms if people want to talk about anything specific, or we can just hang out and see what's up. For those of you who don't want to hop in, we also have the expo hall open where most of the partners have dropped really great documents or just have resources if you want to get in touch with them. We're so grateful for everybody's time today at the Onchain Giving Summit, and we will see you tomorrow for Advisors Day. But hop into networking. I'm down to just like debrief and say hello to whoever's around and just connect because we are a community. So thanks for being here. Cheers. Bye, y'all. Thank
Bye.
you.